This presentation is on soil compaction, and although we work for BKT, this is it's kind of a generic presentation. It applies to all brands, everything. We're going to talk about soil compaction, what it is, how tires affect soil compaction, and we're going to run through some of the different new tires that are out that may help you some. Some of these have been out for a while and new. So hopefully with this, and like Alan said, if you have any questions on it, we'll address them. We'll try to do our best to address them and answer your questions. So with that, we'll get started. So soil compaction, what is soil compaction and what is its effects on crops? There's basically three things that are happening now. There's tilled soil, and as you can see, tilled soil basically is a turning plow or a moldboard. It just it goes down so deep, and it just turns the soil upside down, so you have no trash on top of the ground. It gets rid of all the trash. With tilled soil, it reduces soil strength. It increases the depth of tracks and reduces traction. So whenever you run across it, you have deeper tracks. But the one thing it does do is it does allow oxygen in the soil to help with decomposition when you turn the top into the bottom. It does loosen up the soil, but as you drive across it, it compacts the soil again in the tire tracks. There's minimum or limited till. As you can see with the Hera, you run across, you just kind of cut up the top of it. It doesn't bury it in the ground like tillage does. And then there's no till, where the corn stalks, soybean stalks, trash are on top of the ground and you plant over them. What this does though is it keeps it, one of the purposes of no-till is for soil erosion. It minimizes soil erosion. When you have windstorms and things like that, it doesn't blow all your topsoil off over into the next state and that kind of deal. So soil compaction is an increase in the bulk density and a decrease in pore space of the soil. It's caused by applying pressure to the soil with tractors, trucks, combines, and grain carts, and it causes a physical barrier to normal, healthy root growth. So in the next couple of slides, we're going to talk a little bit more about pore space and the strength in the soil, but it has a lot of, when you plant your corn, beans, whatever, you want them to be able to grow. You want the roots to be able to grow down and out so that they can go after the nutrients and the water in the soil. With compaction, if you look at the stalk of corn that I have circled in red there, that one has restricted root growth from excessive compaction. If you'll notice the other stalks, they kind of grow down and out. And that one, it hits a hard place in the dirt, and they don't grow down, so they just start growing out. What it does, of course, it reduces, by having compacted soil, it reduces the amount of corn that you get, and it also, the stalks are in wind and things like that. The stalks are a lot weaker; they'll blow over a lot easier. There again, you can see the roots. From excessive soil compaction, circled in red, versus the other roots that are good, where it gives them a stable base to grow from. That doesn't mean they won't grow anything, but they just don't grow as much. It's your yields are very limited, or more so limited because of compaction. So the effects of soil compaction, there is reduced water infiltration. It doesn't let the water in like it should. Water holding capacity and air exchange. It doesn't let air and water in. The thing about soil is in years when moisture is either in short supply or excessive, if you have good soil, it acts as a reservoir or a conduit system for water. It shoots the water out, it gets the water out when it's excessive, and it holds moisture in when it's not excessive. So it buffers the effects of moisture extremes. If you'll notice the tractor I've got there, it kind of shows the weight of the tire. You're gonna always have topsoil disturbance, but what you don't want to compact is the subsoil, where you get about, I don't know, 8 or 9 inches where you get below the topsoil. So ideal soil is composed of about 50% pore space allocated equally to water and air. This allows the roots to displace the soil as they grow. It lets them grow into the soil instead of hitting a hard pan and then going out in right and left directions. Heavy wheel traffic, especially under wet conditions, damages the soil structure, and wet soils are more susceptible to compaction. And that's because they rut, they mash, they push down more, and things like that. Sometimes we don't have a chance to not do that, because if you got to plant, or you got to get in the fall, if you got to get crops out and it's wet, sometimes you don't have that chance, you don't have that opportunity to wait. So I mean, it happens. So on soil compaction, if you look at the graph on the left, the air and water, that's what good soil looks like. It has, you've got soil, you've got water in there, and you've got space for air. When it's compacted, it looks like the one on the right. All those open spaces are pushed together. So if you'll notice, there's a lot more water in there than there is air. So when the roots, when they encounter a physical barrier to growth, there's nowhere for them to move the soil. If you look at the diagram, you look at the one on the little thing on the left, you can see where it hit the hard pan and it starts growing out, versus the one on the right in aerated soil, how it grows out, but it also grows down. So the reservoir and the conduit system for water, air, and nutrients are restricted, and adjustments to minimize soil pressure also minimizes compaction. And there's ways to do that, which we'll talk about in just a sec. You're going to always have some surface soil disturbance because you drive over, because it's driven over. That's just, there's no way to get away from that. But again, like I said, you don't want to compact the subsoil underneath that. So maximizing your tractive efficiency, have traction with the tractor, and minimizing compaction are compatible goals. Air pressures in tires and tires can affect that. The tires you choose and the air pressures that you run. But both increase profitability. You burn less fuel, you have less time in the field, you get better yields. Reducing compaction results in increased crop productivity, and cover crops help open soil up. I know in the US and Canada now, a lot of people, especially up north, are growing cover crops like radishes and some of the winter rye and stuff like that. And what they do is, because of the roots and stuff, when they grow down, they push the soil back open again and they open it back up. There's several causes of compaction. Some are natural and some are man-induced. Compaction is the force is great, such as from a tractor, a combine or tillage implement, or truck that runs across the field, or it can come from something as small as a raindrop. This is one of the raindrop impacts. You get this is a natural cause of compaction. You see it as a soil crust. It's usually less than a ½ inch thick at the soil surface, but it can prevent seedling emergence. If you plant and you get that, and your soil starts doing this, and the seeds can't come up through. So generally, rotary hoeing often fixes that problem. For deep tillage, research results have shown few positive yield responses to subsoiling. When they do occur, they're relatively small and variable, so they don't really affect the crops that much. Predicting the effects of subsoiling is difficult. It could be due to some of the following, which is soil differences, degree of subsoil compaction. The harder it's compact, the more it's compact, the harder it is to uncompact it. Soil moisture, traffic, weather conditions, the crops grown, and the tillage methods. So with compaction, with tillage, continuous moldboard plowing or disking at the same depth, it causes tillage pans. So you'll have a hardened layer under where you till at, just below the depth of the tillage in some soils. The tillage pan is generally relatively thin, 1 to 2 inches thick, and it may not have a significant effect on crop production. It's just according to how deep the roots need to grow on the crops. It can be fixed by varying depth of tillage over time or by special tillage operations. And I'll say this, we're talking about soil compaction and no-till and minimum till. There's a lot of places where people still till at. If you get in sandy soil, In the south, we grow a lot of cotton and stuff like that, and in those areas, the dirt's somewhat sandy, so everybody still tills that. We're talking more of kind of like a loamy, wet, a little bit wetter dirt. And what's happened is because of soil erosion, because of conservation in North America, with soil erosion, topsoil blowing off, things like that. That's what's kind of led to the no-till way of farming. But if you do no-till, you know, there's special equipment for it, and you have to be very careful with the dirt to not compact it, to not press it down. Heavily trafficked soils, they retain moisture longer, they recharge more slowly, and they're slower to warm up compared to less compacted soils. Because less compacted soils is, like we talked about before, they have the porous space in them, so they let water in or out, they let air in or out, so they warm up quicker. If you'll notice the picture on the left where the moisture has been retained longer in the compacted wheel tracks, because it's pressed down so the water can't get out of it. And if you'll notice the fill on the right, of course, where the tracks are at, how the water's gathered in the tracks. Wheel traffic is the major cause of soil compaction. With increasing farm sizes, of course, there's a limited window of time to get planting and harvesting done in a timely manner. Sometimes you don't have a choice but to get in when it's wet, and we understand that. But whenever you do go in and it's wet, this is some of the things that it causes. One of the other things is tractor weights have increased from less than 3 tons in the 1940s to approximately 20 tons today for the big 4-wheel drive tractors. Spring planting is often done before the soil is dry enough to support the heavy planting equipment, and harvest is sometimes done in wet falls. When you have to get it out, you got to get it out. So as we talked about before, soil compaction, it increases the soil density. The roots are less able to penetrate the soil, and they're generally shallow and they're mound formed, like the one on the left is. And because their growth is restricted, they're less able to exploit the soil for nutrients and moisture. So they have a harder time getting the water and the nutrients, the fertilizer and things like that, nitrogen, whatever you put in, back out of the ground. So one of the side effects of compaction is nitrogen and potassium deficiencies are the most common. This leads to more fertilizer requirements and increases your production costs. And you can see the corn leaves there, the one on the bottom with the nitrogen deficiency, they start yellowing instead of staying the pretty green that they should be. Since we're talking about the north, a couple myths I found this. The freestyle cycles will alleviate most of the soil compaction created by machinery. That was a myth that people have kind of thrown out there. Well, I can compact it, and then the freestyle cycles will take care of that. Some soils are subject to annual freestyle cycles and freeze depths of 3 feet or more. Unfortunately, only about the top 2 to 5 inches will experience more than one freestyle cycle per year. So it doesn't get very deep. The belief that the freestyle cycle loosens compacted soils probably came about years ago when compaction would have been relatively shallow because the equipment was a lot lighter. It wasn't near as heavy as equipment is today. So combining heavy axle loads and wet soil conditions increases the compaction's depth in the soil. The equipment now that we have is so much heavier, and we're going to talk about some of the heavy equipment in just a sec. So for example, a load of 10 tons per axle or more on wet soils can extend compaction to depths of 2 feet or more. Because this is well below the normal depth of normal tillage, the compaction is more likely to persist compared to shallow compaction that can largely be removed by tillage. Generally, whenever you till, I think it's like about 18 inches is generally about as far as you get down, maybe a little bit deeper, unless you're going real deep. So as you can see, the freestyle cycle doesn't do much for breaking that up. And one of the other myths is whatever compaction Mother Nature doesn't take care of, deep tillage or subsoiling will. While deep tillage, which is greater than 18 inches, is capable of shattering the hard pans created by the wheel traffic, it hasn't really proven. The University of Minnesota did a study, and it wasn't proven to increase the yield consistently or for a long period of time. So the best thing to do is try not to, if you're doing no-till, is try not to compact the soil. You have to learn to take care of it. Compaction, it can be alleviated to a limited degree in excessively dry soils by cracks. Unfortunately, the cracks, it only breaks up compaction to the depth of the crack, and most of the cracks doesn't go down that deep. So even though Mother Nature can help, it doesn't help to a great degree, not with the heavy equipment and stuff that we use. So any equipment, whether you use tires or tracks, it can cause compaction. A parked track tractor exerts a ground pressure of about 4 to 8 pounds per square inch, depending on the track width, the length, and the tractor weight. This pounds per square inch changes whenever you start driving because of the mid rollers, the spring stiffness, the track stiffness, the dynamic weight transfer under your drawbar whenever you take off. So I know that there's a big discussion going on, and you hear it all the time between tracks and tires, which is the best, which is the worst. They both have their advantages, they both have their disadvantages, but that's another thing. So radial tires, so we talked about tracks. Tracks exert, if it's parked, basically about 4 to 8 pounds per square inch. Radial tires exert a pressure of 1 to 2 pounds higher than their inflation pressure. So if a radial tire is, say it's inflated to 6 psi, you have a 7 to 8 pounds per square inch ground bearing pressure on the soil. And this pressure depends on lug size, the tire stiffness, drawbar load, 3-point hitch, that kind of deal. So older style bias ply tires inflated only 6 to 8 psi they don't operate efficiently and they easily wear out with low air pressure. Bias ply tires are not made to run at low air pressures. They are made to run, I don't know, 20 to 35 psi according to the size of the tire. The problem with bias ply tires, there's a place for bias. We still sell a lot of bias ply tires, but if you run them if you're row crop farm and run them at low inflation pressures, you destroy the sidewalls of them and you destroy the tire itself. So bias ply tires are not made to run at low air pressures. Radials, you can run radials at lower air pressures. So total axle weight, as well as the contact pressure between the tire and the soil, affects the subsoil compaction. But historically, as equipment weight increases, as the tractors get bigger, the combines get bigger, tire size also increases. So you get a bigger tire and a wider tire with a longer footprint. So you're spreading the weight of that equipment out over a bigger area. But this avoids drastic increases in the tire's contact pressure on the soil surface. So with the bigger tires, the wider tires, longer footprints, it kind of knocks down some of the ground bearing pressure. There's no single simpler way to improve the tractor efficiency than to use the proper tire inflation pressure. Proper tire inflation not only improves the tractor efficiency, but it reduces compaction's intensity from the tires. So in most data books, whatever manufacturer, they have load inflation tables. And I took this out of ours, and this is basically what a load inflation table looks like. Now this is in miles per hour and PSI. But if you'll notice on the left, the miles per hour, it goes from 5, 20, 25, and 30. And to the right, it shows air pressures on the very top, and it shows how much weight they'll carry per air pressure. These weights and all in these load and index tables, those are at max load at those speeds, right? So if you look, I mean, at 46 psi, you can carry a lot more weight than you do at 23 psi. But if you're running singles or duals or whatever you're running, you may only need 23 psi, or you may only need 17 psi to carry the weight. But you've got to have enough air pressure in the tires to carry the weight of the tractor and the implements that you're carrying. And always plan for worst case scenario. If you don't do that, then you start having tire problems, and sidewalls start coming apart, and they start separating in the sidewalls and things like that. So these load inflation tables are very handy charts to use to figure out what air pressures you need to be running at the weight and things like that you're carrying, and by the weight of the tires. So when duals or triples are added to a tractor, it reduces the carrying load on each tire because you've got more flotation. So you're reducing the necessary tire inflation pressure. So if you run duals or triples rather than singles, you can reduce air pressure in the tires. And remember that we said that the ground bearing pressure is 2 psi over the air pressure. So the less you can reduce the air pressure in tires, the less ground bearing pressure you have, the less soil compaction you have. The total axle weight for heavy field equipment such as grain carts or combines, it's nearly the same regardless of whether you use tracks or tires with it. A 25 ton per axle grain cart still creates subsurface compaction whether it has tracks or tires. Because it's heavy, it carries a lot of weight. The tracks do have a longer footprint. Tracks, and according to the size of tracks, they can be pretty narrow, so you don't have as much track on the ground, but they can be wider where you spread the weight out. A lot of these grain carts now are using the big tires, the 1050/50/32s, 1250/50/32s. You can run those. You carry less weight in them than the old bias ply tires that we used to use on there. You carry less air pressure in them for some of the same weight, so that also reduces ground bearing pressure. Like combines, grain carts, and liquid manure spreaders, which we see a lot of now, manure spreaders and liquid manure spreaders, the carrying capacity on these things are enormous, and axle loads can be as high as 40 tons, which is a lot of weight. The tire industry, of course, has designed the radial tires to replace bias for the larger equipment because you can run less air pressure in the radials than you do the bias, and you have less ground bearing pressure. Liquid manure spreader manufacturers have been adding more axles as the tank load increases, reducing load per axle. Some of these manure spreaders are extremely heavy because they have manure, it's wet. The tires, flotation tires have gotten bigger, they've gotten wider, and with them adding more axles to it, because when these things first came out, they had one axle, and then they added 2 axles, and now some of these have 3 or 4 axles. And they have to have that to carry the weight because a lot of times the tires won't carry that much weight. And especially if you're running down the highway 60, 70% of the time at 30, 31 miles an hour. And some of these guys are using the fence and the JCBs now, which will run 40 or 45. So you've got speed along with the heat buildup and along with the weight, the carrying capacity. So this was something that was kind of interesting. So if this was, they did this test, and it was a number of passes till the concrete failed. They put 6 inches of Portland cement concrete. A 7-axle tractor trailer, 96,000 pounds, made 78,000 passes on that before the concrete started failing, 6 inches. A grain cart, 875 bushel grain cart, 57,000 pounds, with single axles, in less than 10 passes, the concrete started cracking and coming apart. On the 7-inch concrete, the same tractor made 175,000 passes, and the grain cart, single axle grain cart, made less than 30 before the concrete started cracking and things like that. So if you think about what that does on concrete, think about what that does to your field. It's a lot of weight on one axle. And that's why a lot of these manufacturers have started spreading out and making more in single axles, dual axles, triple axles to distribute the weight better. So managing the tractor parameters, we're going to talk about managing tire inflation pressure. I know when you go buy a new tractor, they have the tractor set up, they have the tires on there that you use, and according to the row spacing that you use is according to the size tractor tires that you use. But they should be selected to provide the maximum contact area with the soil surface. Of course, if you plan on narrow roads, you have to go to a narrow tire. Some people dual them up, some people triple them up to spread that weight out. The contact area depends on the size, the type, the number of tires, and the inflation pressure. But properly inflated radial tires provide a larger and flatter footprint than bias ply tires. On bias ply tires, like we said before, you can't run them at low air pressures. They have to be pumped up. They have a stiffer sidewall. On radial tires, when you can run them at lower air pressures, and again, you have to have the right amount of air pressure to carry the weight. but when you put the air pressure in there, the tire gets that radial bulge in it. And the radial bulge allows the tire to spread out. It gives you a little bit wider footprint. It gives you a little bit longer footprint. So you have more weight to distribute the weight from the tractor, implements, whatever. There has been some new technology that's come out in the last, I don't know, 10 years or more. IF tires were developed first. An IF tire will carry 20% more weight at the same air pressure as a standard tire. So if you got like a 380/90 R46 and you got it, and you have a standard tire and you have an IF, the IF will carry 20% more weight at the same air pressure. The VFs came out later, and the VF rated tires will carry 40% more weight at the same air pressure as a standard tire. Now I'll say on some of these tires, the IF and VF tires, they're needed to carry the weight of the equipment and the tractor. So you have to run high air pressures in them. An example is a sprayer, like the big John Deere sprayers or case sprayers with the big booms and stuff on them. They run 40 miles an hour down the highway. They carry a lot of weight. So you have to run a lot of air pressure in those. But in tractor tires, you can reduce air pressures in tractor tires, because if it can carry the same weight at 20 or 40% less air pressure, then you can drop air pressures down to carry the same weight at less air pressure, and it gives you a wider footprint, and it puts more lugs on the ground for you for traction. It allows for less slippage, fuel savings, and a wider footprint. Now, we realize the IF and VF technology tires are more expensive than the standard radial tires are, but they also have some benefits that you can probably use, especially if you do no-till stuff. Because as we talked about, the less air pressure you run in them, the less ground compaction you have. Large dual radial tires or super singles that are maintained at the minimum tire inflation pressures, they transmit power to the soil through the largest area. The more area you have on the ground, the better traction you have. And it also reduces the pressure by the tire on the ground, because it increases the contact area of the tires. When duals are used in place of single tires, each tire carries a smaller portion of the weight of the tractor. And again, tire inflation pressures can be reduced, whether you're using standard IF or VF. So when tire pressures are reduced, the tire flexes over a larger area. This reduces the pressure applied to the soil, and it reduces compaction. But you have to remember that what oil is to a motor and coolant is to a radiator, so is air to a tire. It has to have enough air in it. If you don't have the correct amount of air in it, the tire can fail. But you can go from one extreme to the other. Too much air in a tire decreases the flexion of the casing. You have an expensive bias by tire, and it results in a smaller footprint. So you have increased compaction and you have a rougher ride. It also increases impact brakes and things like that. If you hit something, too little air stresses the tire casing, and it leads to rapid wear. If you have it underinflated and overloaded, then it's almost like a coat hanger. You're taking a coat hanger and bending it back and forth. Eventually, the cords in the sidewall of the tire give way. You start getting air bubbles in the side of the tire, sidewall separations, and things like that. But either extreme can hurt the performance, and it can ruin a tire. If you run the proper inflation where it carries the load like it should, it doubles the life of an ag tire. This translates to money saved, because you're not constantly buying tires every year or every 2 years. But again, you must match the weight of the tractor and the implements to the correct air pressures. Some of the best practices of checking air is check air pressure often. Ideally, it's every day or at least once a week when working. I know when you're out working, it's hard to check it every day, but at least get it once a week or maybe a couple of times a week. Use a calibrated pressure gauge. Take air pressure in the morning when the tire is cold. The reason for this is during the day as you're working with it, it has heat buildup in a tire. If you start off with 10 PSI, by the time you're done working in the afternoon or whatever, it warms up outside, the tire's moving, it creates heat, it could take it up 4 or 5 or 6 psi. And so if you check air when the tire's hot and you let air pressure out, now you've got an underinflated tire, because when it's cold, then it's underinflated. It's recommended to ballast the tractor each time implements are changed. I know sometimes that's done and sometimes it's not, but if and that is for the ballast tractor, because different implements have different effects on tractors. If you're pulling something with a heavy draw, like a chisel plow, things like that, and then you go to planters that doesn't have a heavy draw, the setup on the tractor changes. And I know with the size of farms and stuff now, I know some people have tractors just for planting, some have just for tillage, some have just for, they're more specific now instead of taking one tractor and doing everything with it. But and I know that's not always possible. And the dealerships, John Deere, Case New Holland, all these guys, they're very good at setting up tractors now. Don't really see a lot of problems with power hop anymore. But if the weight of the tractor gets out, it can create power hop problems. So to kind of finish up here, soil conservation, where we came from. Back in the early days, of course, this is in the Midwest in the United States. Back during the Dust Bowl era, there was no such thing as soil conservation, no such thing as no-till, any of that kind of stuff. So and it's in some areas out there, it's pretty sandy. So whenever wind storms came in, it blew the topsoil 2 or 3 states over to somebody else's field. So there was a lot of dust storms, a lot of dry conditions. You can see the dust storms there. Believe it or not, but even in some areas, you still see this where they do the tillage with the moldboards and things like that in the spring, in February and March and April, whenever the winds come through and it gets windy, you still see some dust storms occasionally. The difference between now and then is they had to depend on Mother Nature for rain, and now they irrigate. There's irrigation, there's center pivot irrigation and things like that. So it keeps the soil more moist than it did back in those days because there was no irrigation. So a lot of people now that are no-tilling, they plant cover crops, and the cover crops help the soil. It helps put nutrients back in the soil that some crops take out. It also helps open up the soil, so when you go back in and plant again, then your seeds have room to grow. They have room for the roots to spread out. They pick up the soil, the nutrients in the soil, and so you just have better crops. And this is just some pictures of some cover crops. But as you can see, the cover crops help when it rains. It keeps it from washing out, things like that. So, and so that is that's the end of it. If there's any questions or anything I can answer, I'll be happy to try to do it for you.
Dave, we got a couple questions that came up.
Okay, hold on just a second. Let me get out of this.
Okay.
All right, there you go.
All right, so the first one's from Owen. Let me finish before you jump in, because the question has a comment at the end too. So what have you seen with yield effect to corn and soybean due to hard pan? And he has said that we have seen a lot of compaction from manure spreading in Ontario, which you talked about, the heavy weights.
Yep. Yep. So what happens with it when a root growth, they'll go down until they hit the hard pan, and when they hit the hard pan, they start spreading out. They start going, instead of growing straight down, they start going left and right. And what that does is it does affect yield, but what it really affects is if you don't have a stable plant. If you get a windstorm, it blows it over instead of it standing up. And it can't go down and and if it's real dry outside, if we have a dry summer, then it can't go down into the dirt and get the moisture out of it, or get the nutrients to fertilizer and things like that. So you're not getting the full benefit of your money by fertilizing it, and unless you irrigate it, unless you have center pivot irrigation, which costs money, the root can't go down can't go down below the hard pan to get the nutrients and the moisture out of that. We're seeing a lot of problems kind of everywhere with manure spreaders. These things have gotten so big and so heavy because people want to do so much at one time with them. And that's why they went to 3 axles, 4 axles, but we still see some problems with them being overloaded. So if they're overloaded, you have to run max air pressures in them. So you're going to, you get soil compaction from using them. Now I know there's a benefit to using it, but unfortunately, kind of the side effect of that is the soil compaction that you get from them. Did that answer your question?
Owen, let us know if we answered that correctly. We got another question from Barry. He's asked if you can explain what ballast the tractor means.
Okay, yeah. So ballast on. So what happens with a tractor is you have, I don't know, you've got a 450 horsepower tractor, and so all the power is in the engine. Well, you got to have some way to get that power to the ground. You got to get that engine power to the ground. And if you put no ballast on it and you hook, say, a chisel plow to it, the tires will just sit there and spin. They won't pull it. They may pull it, but it'll be at 2 or 3 miles an hour instead of 5 or 8 miles an hour or 10 or whatever you want to pull it at. So what you're doing is you're weighting the tractor down. On mechanical fronts are real important for that, and 4-wheel drives you have to weight them down also. But basically by ballasting, you're putting and they make different weights. You can put water in the tires or calcium chloride, beet juice, things like that. Some people put those in the tires to ballast it with. The most common thing is the weights, like wheel weights that you put on, or you put the saddle weights on the front of the tractor. And a tractor has to be set up with the weights where, according to the horsepower of the tractor, the tractor has to weigh so much to be efficient. And you have to weight it to get to that weight. If you don't, then you have to, the tractor sits there and spins and you burn a lot of fuel. So you have to get the horsepower to the ground, and that's why you ballast it.
Dave, maybe you can just touch too on the fact that although you can use calcium in that, we would never use just water here in Canada because that would cause a headache. But you also may want to touch on the fact that if you're using calcium or whatever, you tend not to want to do that with radial tires, because as you fill that tire more and more with a fluid of some sort, you're taking away the benefit of having a radial and almost making it into a biased tire.
Yes. So people in some areas still use fluid in there. It's still commonly used thing. People have been using fluid for 70, 80 years to make the tractor heavier. But as Alan said, we always recommend using the metal weights. And I know the reason that people use calcium chloride and antifreeze in water and beet juice and things like that is because it's cheaper. However, the metal weights, you can add them and take away as you need to. And if you buy another tractor, you can take the weights off of one tractor and put it on another tractor. You can move weights around. When you put fluid in tires, on radial tires, it's only recommended to fill them at 40%, which is the 4 o'clock position on the tire, right? If you fit, and it doesn't hurt them, you can fill them completely full. But if you fill them completely full, you have a very expensive bias ply tire, because it takes away all the radial characteristics. It takes away the radial bulge. It takes away the ability for the radial to spread out over a bigger area of ground with a longer footprint. So there's some definite disadvantages to using liquid. Also, if you use calcium chloride, it eats up wheels and stuff like that, because calcium chloride's salt. And if you spill it on the ground, where you spill it at, nothing grows. Beet juice is not as bad, but beet juice is very sticky. It gums pumps up. So there's the advantages to putting fluid in tires is cost. The disadvantages is some of the side effects like wheels and things like that.
And Dave, just a little further to yes, Barry said that he appreciated the clarity. And Owen said you answered his question perfectly as well. Just to further comment, tractor dealers love when you leave your weights on and don't take them to move them to your next tractor, because they'll take them off and resell them.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
As Dave said, keep them and move them to your next tractor. It'll save you some money, and your dealer isn't making a whole bunch of money off of what you traded in. He'll make his fair share without that, trust me. So I don't see any other questions right now, Dave. But anybody that has further questions, please feel free to reach out to us through the virtual booth, and we'll try to answer your questions best we can. I think, you know, unless there's more, and Brittany, I don't see any more. I think we've kind of hit to where we are probably done, unless Dave or Joe, you got anything else to add?
Nope, so I don't see any more questions here. And as Alan said, feel free to reach out to them on their virtual booth in the exhibitor showcase. And they also have their UTV ride and drive in the demos and programming section to check out as well. Thanks everyone for joining, and please enjoy the rest of your time at Canada's Digital Farm Show.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Great.
everyone.
Thank you.